before I start, I do want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past and present. A story of what's happened to Australia's TAFE system, which I think we're now seeing rolling out every day in the media, but really what's happened to TAFE really is a national shame. The issues in corrective services, I think, are a real mirror image of what's happened in TAFE as well. And I think Maury quite rightly made the point in his presentation that that one of the big issues facing us in the school sector, and I think people need to be really clear about this, is that what's happened in TAFE, if we are not able to fight back and to fight back for our TAFE system, and if we're not able to keep the struggle up in the public school system, we face a very grim future as far as public education is concerned. I think there are two things to say about TAFE as I explain what's happened to it, which are really important as an underpinning of the story of what's happened to it. The first is that what is happening to TAFE in Australia is that it is being privatised. Even though on a daily basis what we see is the emergence of a voracious private for-profit vocational education sector, what underpins the strategy of both levels of government, federal and state across the country, is a strategy to privatise the TAFE system. And if you dig further below that, the issue there is that what governments are trying to do is shift the costs of vocational education from governments onto students. What we are seeing at the moment is a wholesale shift in the way in which the sector is funded. And I say again, what we're seeing is an attempt by governments to completely defund public vocational education and to shift all of the costs of of vocational education onto individual students. So the second part of that I think is really important to make, to highlight before I go into exactly how this has happened, is that TAFE is the worst funded of all of the education sectors. Now, again, every time I say this genuinely in the context of absolutely being an advocate for public education and absolutely not encouraging a politics of envy or a competition between the education sectors. But it's really important to understand that vocational education is the worst funded of all of the education sectors, and that it has been for 20 years. And in fact, just to highlight that, TAFE funding has declined in the last 20 years by about 45%, in the last 10 years by about 25%, and in the last year, where the process has really accelerated, by 10%. I guess that what it means for us is that in real terms, TAFE has half as much funding to do the job that it's doing at the moment than it did 20 years ago. And I can tell you now that 20 years ago, TAFEs were still hard places to work and funding was never generous. So we are now doing that same amount of work, and in fact, in many respects, much more complex work, with half as much funding as we did 20 years ago. So even though we're looking every day at a sector where you hear about the rip-offs and the rorts and towards the end of my presentation, I'll talk to you about the sorts of what only can be called super profits that these huge private providers are making. Just tuck it away in your brain that I've already told you that TAFE and VET is the worst funded of all of the education sectors, and where that will lead us to at the end is a really significant question about how it is that private for-profit providers are making the profits they are in such a significantly underfunded sector. The story of the privatisation of TAFE, or if you like, the story of where we've got to at the moment, started many, many years ago. But in a formal sense, and certainly for New South Wales, it started in the 2012 National Agreement for Skills and Workforce Development. Now, that was a national agreement which all states and territories and the Commonwealth governments it's their mechanism for organising the allocation of funding into the sector. And in that national agreement, there were two key requirements in the context of a third. The two key requirements, and this is really the laying down of the architecture of the privatisation of this sector. The two key requirements were a requirement that the federal government required the states to enact in their state TAFE systems in order to have access to federal government funding for a national entitlement. It was called a national entitlement. The second key piece of the architecture of that privatisation process was the introduction of vet fee help, an income contingent loan scheme. And I want to spend a little bit of time with both of those as we lead towards the end of the presentation. The national entitlement and vet fee help, the income contingent loan scheme, were both situated in the context of a requirement by the federal government that the states open all of their public funding to the private sector through competition, through a competitive allocation of funding. So you had a national entitlement, you had vet fee help, and all of that in the context of an absolute requirement that the states had to sign up to, that they open up that they open up all of their public funding to competition from the private sector to deliver training. Now, the national entitlement was voucher funding. The national entitlement, the requirement from that federal government to have a national entitlement was voucher funding. What it did was it separated funding from institutions of education, TAFE colleges, and it effectively attached that funding to the body of the student, to the individual student, who then had a voucher which they could expend at a private or public college of their choice. That was the mechanism around which you severed the connection between public funding and the educational institution. Now, the second requirement was the introduction of vet fee help. Vet fee help is really one of the most damaging things which we at the time opposed. We've opposed for a long time income contingent loans in the sector. But it has been one of the most damaging tools for the privatisation of the sector, and I think, as I say, we opposed it vehemently and understood how important it was to keep it out of the sector, but I don't think even we understood just how rapidly that scheme would grow and how much damage it would do to the sector. What I should explain to you is that upon the introduction of through the national agreement of voucher funding and vet fee help, that key requirement that that public funding be allocated contestably has basically seen the sector, the opening up of the sector to private providers. It's just completely blown the sector open. So that nationally, what we've seen is that maybe about 8 or 9 years ago, the proportion of funding which was allocated contestably was around about 10 or 15%. Now we're looking at a sector whose competitive allocation, whose pool of funding which is open to the private sector has just hit 48%. In fact, our figures are 2014. That's the lag that we get in statistics. It's likely to be more than that this year, but it's hit 48%. Now, what that means is, in real terms, what it means is that 48% of the recurrent funding for vocational education is open to private for-profit providers to tender and to deliver, and I use that word advisedly, to deliver training. And currently that recurrent funding sits at around about $7 billion a year. Not enough, we say, but when you think about it, 48% of $7 billion open to a rotting private sector is a huge amount of funds available to them. The story of vet fee help sits alongside the story of the opening up of the sector to competition, and it has delivered the private sector massive amounts of public funding, and that public funding is in the form, in real terms, is in the form of debt for the next generation, for our current generation of young people who are being signed up to these loans. And when we explain it to people, we talk in terms of HECS in the university sector, because that's generally seen to be that's the thing that people understand most. Now, HECS in universities, it is an income contingent loan. The income contingency, which it has in common with vet fee help, it means that students have to repay their loan when their income reaches a certain level, and that level currently is around about $54,000. Many of us in this room will recall the struggles of the mid to late 80s under a Hawke government who introduced income contingent loans to the higher education sector. For many of us opposed the introduction of the loans and fees in universities. HECS in universities is a loan scheme where there's about a 40-60 split. So 40% of the costs of a qualification are borne by the student through HECS, and 60% is subsidised by the government. Fees in universities are highly regulated. Universities have regulated fees, and they cannot charge more than those regulated fees. And private universities do not have access to HECS loans. They can't offer HECS loans. So it's a highly regulated scheme. We didn't like it at the time because of the introduction of fees in universities, but it is a highly regulated loan scheme. As we all suspected and now know, the costs to students have increased over the years. It used to be a much smaller cost, it's a much larger one now, and that's not a good thing. But it is a scheme which is tightly controlled and hotly defended, as you know, by advocates and critics alike. Vet fee help was introduced into vocational education in 2008. Vet fee help is quite different than HECS. Under vet fee help, students pay the full cost of the qualification. Number one, they pay the full cost of the qualification. Fees in vocational education are not regulated at all. That means that providers can charge whatever they want. They can charge students whatever they want for a qualification, and the students can borrow the full cost of the qualification through vet fee help. The only limit on what a provider charges a student is it's about $99,500. It's close to $100,000, which is the lifetime limit on what a student can borrow under vet fee help. So the only restriction on how much a student can borrow through vet fee help, and therefore how much a provider can charge a student, is the $100,000 limit on their borrowings. There is no government subsidy attached to the vet fee help loan. It is the full cost that students bear. And despite what people will try to tell you, it is quite a different loan scheme than the HECS scheme in universities. Now, vet fee help was introduced into the vocational education and training sector, as I said, in 2008. Its conditions were liberalised and expanded in the 2012 National Agreement. It was basically made much easier for providers to access and to offer vet fee help loans. In 2009, $25 million was expended on the vet fee help loan scheme nationally, $25 million. Last year, in 2015, we estimate that $4 billion was expended on vet fee help. So I'll just say that again, $25 million in 2009 when it was first introduced, $4 billion last year. The other thing about vet fee help, completely unsurprisingly, is that 84% of vet fee help loans, go to the private sector. So when I spoke to you a little minute ago about 48% of government funds now being open to the private sector under the National Agreement, which is, $3 or $4 billion annually, add to that 84% of $4 billion last year, and you will see what has happened to vocational education and to TAFE colleges in Australia. What has happened is they have been, in a wholesale way, undermined, underfunded, and then a voracious and completely unregulated, if you like, private sector has been allowed to step in and to exploit students. It's unbelievable that a scheme like this can be allowed, that what has happened under vet fee help has been allowed to happen, because bear in mind that this money is now attached in the form of debt to students, to young people, or to people who have been exploited in the most extraordinary way by brokers who sit outside unemployment agencies, who those people you've seen in shopping centres with their with their stalls selling students' qualifications. They've been signed up, and just let me remind you again, and I'll come back to it, that when you think about vocational education and you think about what's the significant underfunding of the sector, then you have to ask yourself, how is it that so much money has been created or has been turned into profit by the private sector? I'll just tell you a couple of other things about vet fee help. Under vet fee help, and this is a government paper, a federal government discussion paper that was released only about a week ago, what it discovered is that, in blunt terms, it's much better to be white and rich if you want a vet fee help loan, and that's because Indigenous students on average pay 23% more for their vet fee help loan than non-Indigenous students, and that low SES students pay on average 26% more than high SES students on their vet fee help loans. So that means that on average, in the government's own review, Indigenous students were paying about $20,000 for their vet fee help loans, and non-Indigenous students were paying about $14,000 for their vet fee help loan. And similarly, low SES students, their loan costs were about $18,000. High SES students were being charged about $14,000, and that's just reflective of the way in which the scheme has been administered by the private sector, and young people have been exploited and hooked into signing up for qualifications with very little understanding of what they're signing up for. The other issue in the sector, and if this ever told you if this gives you any clear understanding of why it is that what's going on is just so extraordinarily inequitable, tuition fees under vet fee help have gone up about 245%. So costs in the sector have gone up for students by about 245%. So in 2009, the average cost of a qualification was about $4,000. In 2015, it was $14,000. So that's in 5 years. The costs to students have just gone up. It is just a complete explosion of costs. Around about 80% of what they estimate in higher education, about 20% of HECS loans are not honoured. There's about 20% which are called doubtful debt. They're students who never repay the loan. They are now estimating that in vocational education, that figure is likely to be much closer to 50 or 60%. The reason for this is really simple, and it brings us right back to the crucial point about vocational education, and it brings us back to the most crucial reason why these sorts of loan schemes should not be allowed in the sector, is of course because these students' incomes will never reach $54,000. So even if you could assume that the student actually got a qualification which was worthwhile and completed that qualification, many of the industry areas that vocational education serves, like childcare, where vet fee help loans are rife, and like a whole range of other industry areas, are areas where young people will never earn $54,000, and that's been one of the reasons, that's been one of the marketing tools that these people have used. Sign yourself up, you'll never have to repay the loan. But of course they do have to carry the debt for the remainder of their lives. But in many respects it takes us as a society, as far as I'm concerned, it takes us as a society back to that initial question about the introduction of loan schemes into a sector like this, which is that the argument under Hawke all those years ago in the 80s, the argument was that people should pay, that you get some personal gain from education, and therefore you should pay some part of that cost. I mean, that issue in this sector is really quite, it is undermined by the activities and what we've seen go on in terms of the use of these loans. Many of you will, on a daily basis, I think, have seen the collapse of the private colleges and the now public shaming, if you like, of private for-profit vet colleges. About 2 or 3 weeks ago, an ex-policeman, I think his name was Ivan Brown, Phoenix Institute, their college premises were raided by the federal police after a report, actually. It was a report by Paddy Manning that was the report which kicked it off. And our friend Ivan, who I'll go on and explain in a minute how much money he's made out of vocational education, said publicly, when it comes down to it, it's a lot cheaper to train students who don't turn up than it is to train students who do. The issue here is that there is only one way in which the sorts of profits, the super profits that these companies have been making out of the sector, there is only one way that you can make them, and that's by not delivering training. And our regulation, the regulatory system in vocational education was so weak and so inadequate. It's worth remembering that for many of these private providers who did not deliver any training, who signed students up, if they did anything, it was over 2 weekends, would have taken you 18 months at TAFE, who delivered, either nothing or the barest minimum, they were doing nothing wrong. Just think of that. They were doing nothing wrong because the regulatory system did not require them to deliver a minimum number of hours. Despite the fact that they were being paid to deliver hours of training, the regulatory system did not require them to deliver a minimum number of hours. And despite repeated arguments with governments and pressuring of governments to make minimum hours a requirement in the system as a bare minimum for ensuring, if not high quality, at least some quality of training was going on, they absolutely refused to do this. And so people like Ivan Brown, who turned up and said the best way to make money is not to deliver training, he was not doing anything wrong under the regulatory system. And when he goes down and when his college is required to repay the money, it will not be because they didn't deliver training, because the regulatory system was just so weak and remains weak. I've got 6 main colleges who received vet fee help funding in 2015. Careers Australia, which has also just recently gone down, received $229 million. Evoca receives $198 million. Phoenix, $100,000. AIPE, $100,000. Unique, and so on. This is the sort of money. Million. Sorry, who'd have thought? Wishful thinking. That's right. I'll just tell you a couple of other things. Most TAFE colleges in Australia now, and for the last 20 years, for good or for bad, and oftentimes for bad, have been required to rely for increasing proportions of their income on fee-for-service activity. That is, they were required to be competitive. They were required to get funding other than government funding to subsidise the appalling levels of public funding that they got. And the average amount of fee-for-service money that most colleges across the country get is around about 40%. So that means that your TAFE colleges in New South Wales, when you look at them, most of them for the last 10 or 15 years, longer in some states, have been getting about 40% of their income from fee-for-service activity through employers often, delivering targeted training for employers who pay for it, and the remainder, the 60%, comes from the public sector through recurrent funding. Now, in a review in Victoria, which is the lead reform state, the reform state that went earliest and hardest in terms of privatisation of TAFE, they did a review when the Labor government re-won power in the state. They did a review of their absolutely decimated TAFE system, their completely destroyed TAFE system. They did a review of it, and the guy who reviewed it discovered that something like 90%, I think it's 80% of private providers are more than 95% reliant on government funding. Now just think about that. They are completely reliant, 95%. These are companies that were basically set up overnight, and they are completely reliant on the public sector, on public sector money, and that is money that they've taken out of TAFE colleges. Just to emphasise it even more, we commissioned research from the University of Sydney last year to look at how much profits these companies were making. And they discovered that private for-profit providers in Australia were making what they termed super profits. They were profits of anywhere between 30 and 50%. They compared that with what went on in the childcare sector, and even during those awful days, do you remember those awful days with the privatisation of the childcare sector and the private providers were allowed to sort of run rampant and make profits? They made nowhere near 30 and 50%, between 30 and 50% profit. So that huge amount of funding, which has been shifted from the public to the private sector in this exercise, has gone now in the form of profits, huge profits, to the private sector. And I just want to make the point about that, which I have to constantly remind myself of, which is that the study that the University of New South Wales did was before the impact of vet fee help. So the sort of super profits that they estimated, they examined in these colleges were profits that were made before the impact of the vet fee help loan scheme was felt. The current circumstances in which the sector finds itself is reflected in what is a collapse of confidence and a collapse of trust in vocational education, and understandably so. You could understand, you would have to, with daily reporting of the rorts and the rip-offs from the private sector, as we know, for most people and for most young people, how they could contemplate enrolling in further education after this school, you would really have, the confidence and trust in the sector has been destroyed. And as a result, enrolments in the sector are collapsing. As a result, the apprentice enrolments have also declined. So much of our society and so much of our economy depends on what happens in the vocational education and training sector, depends on what happens in TAFE colleges. I think it's a no-brainer that there should be increased funding, but we're not even arguing that at the moment. We're saying that as a first and immediate step, 70% of public funding should be quarantined for the public TAFE system, and that would be that's arguing about the existing pie. It's saying it doesn't cost you anymore, just quarantine that amount of funding and give public TAFE institutions the chance to rebuild trust and rebuild themselves so that they can continue to operate. Just think for a moment that you have got young kids enrolling in vocational qualifications, getting nothing from the provider in return, often getting no training at all, and in many cases walking away with debts of $40,000 and $50,000, which they may not ever be able to repay, but which they'll carry for the remainder of their life as a debt which will have an impact on their quality of life.
Thank you very much, Pat and Maury.